Look at your hands right now. Spread your fingers. Every piece of information you've ever written down, every number you've ever recorded, every message you've ever sent, you did with those 10 fingers. Now imagine building the largest empire in the Americas, spanning 2,500 miles across the most rugged terrain on Earth, governing 12 million people without ever writing a single. The Inca did it. They ran their entire civilization, their census records, their tax collection, their military logistics, their historical archives, using knotted strings called quipu. They built 40,000 kilometers of roads through deserts, mountains, and jungles without the wheel. They constructed buildings so precise that a knife blade can't fit between the stones. 500 years later, and then 168 men showed up and destroyed it all. The fall of the Inca Empire is one of the most staggering events in human history. Not because a great civilization was conquered. Civilizations get conquered all the time, but because of the scale of the mismatch, 168 Spanish soldiers against an empire of millions, and the Spanish won, not through superior numbers, not through superior strategy. They won because they arrived at the exact moment when everything that could go wrong for the Inca had already gone wrong. No other conquest in history involves such absurd odds. At the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror outnumbered the English defenders. When Alexander conquered Persia, he led tens of thousands of Macedonian veterans. When the Mongols swept across Eurasia, they fielded the largest cavalry armies the world had ever seen. But Pizarro conquered the Inca with fewer men than a modern commercial airplane carries. The story should have been impossible, and understanding why it wasn't impossible is understanding one of the most important lessons history has to teach. If you are settling in for the night, this is a story worth drifting off to. It is about timing, disease, family betrayal, and the terrifying fragility of even the mightiest civilizations. Subscribe and stick around. To understand how the Inca fell, you first have to appreciate what they built, because what they built was, by almost any measure, extraordinary. The Inca called their empire Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. It was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. At its peak in the early 1500s, it stretched from modern-day Colombia to central Chile, encompassing parts of 6 present-day countries. It covered an area of roughly 1.8 million square kilometers, and the terrain it covered was insane. Think about what the Inca were dealing with. The Andes are the longest continental mountain range on Earth. Peaks reaching over 6,000 meters, valleys dropping to sea level, coastal deserts that haven't seen rain in decades, cloud forests dripping with moisture, and the Amazon jungle pressing in from the east. The Inca built a functioning empire across all of it. Most empires in history expanded across relatively flat terrain. The Romans built their roads across the Mediterranean basin. The Mongols rode across the Central Asian steppe. The Inca had to build their civilization vertically. Their empire included settlements at sea level and settlements above 4,000 meters. The altitude difference between their highest and lowest cities was greater than the height of most mountains in Europe. Every shipment of food, every movement of troops, every message carried by a runner required climbing and descending some of the steepest terrain on Earth. The backbone of this empire was the Capacnan, the Great Inca Road. more than 40,000 kilometers of engineered pathways connecting every corner of the realm. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the circumference of the entire Earth, and they built it without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals larger than llamas, and without iron tools. Every stone was shaped with bronze implements and positioned by human hands. The road adapted to every landscape it crossed. On the arid coast, workers laid flat stones and compacted sand to create stable surfaces across shifting dunes. In the highlands, they built retaining walls and sophisticated drainage systems that have remained functional for 5 centuries. Where the road met gorges, they constructed suspension bridges from woven plant fibers, some spanning over 45 meters. Where it climbed mountains, they carved switchbacks and stairways directly into the rock face. Along these roads, relay runners called chasqui could carry a message from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of days. They ran in shifts, each covering a section of road before passing the message to the next runner at a way station called a tambo. Every 20 to 30 kilometers, another tambo waited, stocked with food and supplies. It was operating at the speed of an athlete's sprint across some of the most challenging terrain on the planet. A message could travel from Cusco to Quito, a distance of over 2,000 kilometers, in roughly 5 days. Alongside the tambos, the Inca built enormous storehouses called Conquest, strategically positioned throughout the empire. These held everything from dried food to textiles to weapons. In the event of famine, earthquake, or military emergency, the state could distribute supplies rapidly along the road network. It was a logistics system that European nations wouldn't match for centuries. The engineering wasn't just about roads. The Inca transformed the Andean landscape itself. They built agricultural terraces called Andines that turned near vertical mountain slopes into productive farmland. They developed irrigation systems that channeled water across impossible distances. They grew over 70 varieties of potato alone. Their agricultural techniques were so effective that some of their terracing systems are still in use today, 5 centuries later. And they managed all of this without writing. Instead, they used the quipu, knotted strings of different colors and lengths that encoded numerical data, census information, tribute records, and possibly even narrative histories. Trained specialists called quipucamayok could read these knotted codes the way you read a page of text. It was an entirely different approach to information management, and it worked. Some researchers believe the quipu encoded far more than numbers. The patterns of knots, the colors of the strings, the way they were twisted and connected may have recorded stories, laws, and religious practices. We still can't fully decode them. When the Spanish arrived, they destroyed most of the quipu they encountered, seeing them as instruments of a pagan religion. What we know of Inca history comes almost entirely from accounts written by Spanish chroniclers and from the fragments of the quipu tradition that survived. The Inca economy operated on a principle of collective labor rather than money. There was no currency, no markets in the way that Europeans understood them. Instead, every citizen owed labor to the state through a system called the meter. You worked the land, built roads, served in the army, or performed whatever task the state required. In return, the state provided food, clothing, and security from its vast storehouses. It was a reciprocal arrangement that functioned remarkably well as long as the central authority remained intact. But that word intact is the key to everything that followed. The system had no room for disruption. If the meter laborers died of disease, the terraces went unplanted. If the chasqui runners died, messages stopped flowing. If the administrators died, the quipu records went unread. Every piece of the system depended on every other piece. It was beautiful engineering, but it was also incredibly fragile. A system with no redundancy, no backup plan, no way to function at reduced capacity. It either worked perfectly or it didn't work at all. Because the Inca Empire had a vulnerability that no amount of engineering could fix. Everything depended on the Sapa Inca, the emperor. He wasn't just a political leader, he was believed to be a direct descendant of Inti, the sun god. His authority was absolute and divine. Every road led to his capital. Every quipu ultimately reported to his administrators. Every decision of consequence flowed through him. Remove the Sapa Inca, and the entire system lost its center of gravity. The Sapa Inca literally owned everything. The land, the llama herds, the labor of every citizen. Even after death, the previous Sapa Incas were mummified and treated as though they were still alive. Their mummies attended festivals, received offerings, and were consulted through priestly intermediaries. The dead emperors even retained their palaces and estates, which meant that each new Sapa Inca had to build his own from scratch. It was a system of remarkable continuity, but also remarkable rigidity. And there was another structural problem. The Inca had no fixed rule of succession. The throne didn't automatically pass to the eldest son. Instead, the Sapa Inca was supposed to choose his most capable heir. This meant that every succession was a potential crisis. Every royal death could trigger a power struggle, and the empire had expanded so rapidly, absorbing so many different peoples in such a short time, that loyalty was often shallow. Think about the timeline. The Inca Empire as we know it really only began with Pachacuti around 1438. In less than a century, it had grown from a regional kingdom around Cusco to the largest empire in the Americas. Many of the peoples under Inca rule had been conquered within living memory. The Canari, the Chachapoya, the Chimfey, they hadn't forgotten their independence. They were waiting for an opportunity. The Inca method of conquest was effective, but not always gentle. When they absorbed a new territory, they typically offered a choice. Accept Inca rule peacefully, adopt the worship of Inti, send your young men for labor service, and you'll be left largely alone. Resist, and the full weight of the Inca military machine would descend upon you. Those who resisted were sometimes forcibly relocated to distant parts of the empire, a practice called mitma, designed to break up communities that might rebel. The Chimfey, whose kingdom on the northern coast had been the largest rival to the Inca, were conquered by Pachacuti's son Tupac Inca Yupanqui around 1470. Their skilled metal workers were relocated to Cusco to serve the Inca elite. The Chachapoya cloud warriors of the northern highlands resisted fiercely and never fully accepted Inca rule. The Canari of what is now Ecuador were conquered late and bore deep resentment toward their overlords. All of these peoples maintained their own languages, their own traditions, and their own memories of independence. The Inca imposed Quechua as the administrative language and demanded tribute and labor, but they never fully assimilated the dozens of distinct cultures under their rule. The empire was, in many ways, a thin layer of Inca authority spread over a vast and diverse population that tolerated rather than embraced its rulers. And then the opportunity came, not from any rebellion or invasion. It came from something no one in the Americas had ever seen before. Something invisible, something that arrived years before the first Spanish soldier set foot on Inca soil. Smallpox, the disease, had been carried to the Americas by Spanish explorers who landed in Central America and the Caribbean. From there, it spread south along trade routes, jumping from community to community, traveling faster than any army. It reached the Inca Empire around 1524 or 1525, years before any Spaniard arrived in person. It hit catastrophically. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to European diseases. None. Their populations had been isolated from the Eurasian disease pool for over 10,000 years. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diphtheria, chickenpox. These were all common in Europe, where centuries of exposure had built up at least partial resistance. But in the Americas, every single person was equally vulnerable. There were no survivors from previous outbreaks to pass on any immunity. Every infection was a first encounter. When smallpox arrived, it didn't just make people sick. It killed them in staggering numbers. Estimates suggest that between 50 and 90% of the population was affected. Entire communities were wiped out. The communication network of Chasqui runners, the backbone of the empire, began to break down as runners fell sick and died. The storehouses went unreplenished. The terraces went untended. The administrative apparatus that held this vast empire together started failing at every level simultaneously. The disease moved faster than any warning could travel. Remember, the Inca communication system depended on human runners. The virus traveled the same roads, carried by the same people, and it didn't need to stop at way stations to catch its breath. By the time officials in Cusco learned that a strange sickness was spreading through the northern provinces, it had already reached the capital, and the disease didn't discriminate between commoners and royalty. Around 1527, it killed the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac, the last great emperor of the Inca. Huayna Capac had been campaigning in the northern reaches of the empire, near present-day Ecuador, when the mysterious illness struck. He was in his 50s, experienced, and at the height of his power, he had spent years expanding the empire's northern frontier, conquering the fierce peoples of what is now Ecuador and southern Colombia. Before he died, Huayna Capac reportedly learned of strange bearded foreigners who had been spotted along the coast to the north. Some historians believe he grasped, in his final days, that something unprecedented was approaching. But the disease took him before he could prepare. It also killed his chosen heir, Nainan Kyochi, just days later. In one stroke, the disease that no one understood had decapitated the empire. The sun god's descendant was dead. His successor was dead. And the empire had no clear mechanism for dealing with this kind of catastrophe. The death of both the emperor and his heir in such rapid succession sent shockwaves through the empire. The Quipu records that tracked the succession, the administrative protocols, the chain of command. None of it was designed for a scenario where the divine ruler and his replacement both vanished simultaneously. The empire didn't have a constitutional crisis. It had an existential one. What followed was perhaps the most destructive civil war in pre-Columbian American history. Two of Huayna Capac's surviving sons both claimed the throne. Huasca, based in the traditional capital of Cusco, had the backing of the southern nobility and the claim of legitimacy, as his mother was the Sapa Inca's primary wife. Atahualpa, based in the northern city of Quito, had the backing of the empire's most battle-hardened generals and a fierce army of northern veterans. From 1529 to 1532, the two brothers tore the empire apart. Both sides fielded armies of around 60,000 men. The battles were savage. At the Battle of Chimborazo, entire units were annihilated. At Quipaipan, near Cusco, Huasca's forces were routed, and Huasca himself was captured. Atahualpa's generals occupied the capital and began purging Huasca's supporters, executing his wives, children, and relatives in front of him. The brutality was staggering even by the standards of the time. Atahualpa's General Chalcachimac had the skull of a defeated enemy commander made into a gilded drinking cup, which the Spanish later noted Atahualpa was still using years afterward. The Canary people who had sided with Huasca were massacred so thoroughly that their population never fully recovered. This wasn't just a war for the throne, it was a systematic destruction of everyone who had supported the wrong side. The civil war cost an estimated 100,000 lives. It shattered alliances between the Inca rulers and their subject peoples. Communities that had been conquered by the Inca saw the civil war as proof that Inca authority was crumbling. Some, like the Canary, openly sided with one brother against the other. Others simply waited to see who would emerge victorious before deciding their next move. The bonds of loyalty that had held the empire together for nearly a century were dissolving. By early 1532, Atahualpa had won. His brother was a prisoner. His generals controlled Cusco. The empire, battered and bleeding, was his. He retired to the city of Cajamarca in the Andes to rest and celebrate his triumph. Outside the city, his army of perhaps 80,000 battle-tested veterans made camp. The most powerful man in the Americas sat at the center of the most formidable military force on the continent. And that is when 168 Spaniards walked into his empire. Francisco Pizarro was in his mid-50s, from a humble background, and had never distinguished himself in Spain. He was illegitimate, possibly illiterate, and had spent decades in the Americas looking for the kind of fortune that had eluded him at home. He and his partner, Diego de Almagro, had made 2 previous expeditions down the Pacific coast, finding tantalizing hints of a wealthy kingdom to the south, but never the kingdom itself. On his second voyage, Pizarro actually made contact with Inca traders and saw evidence of the empire's wealth, enough to convince the Spanish crown to grant him permission and funding for a third attempt. When they finally entered Inca territory in 1532, they were terrified by what they saw. The roads were better than anything in Europe. The storehouses were full, and the armies they glimpsed in the distance numbered in the tens of thousands. Several of Pizarro's men wanted to turn back. The odds were so absurd that continuing seemed like suicide. But Pizarro had learned something during his weeks on the coast. He had spoken with local people who told him about the Civil War, about the disease that had swept through the population, about the deep divisions between the factions of Huasca and Atahualpa. He realized that this enormous empire was wounded, and a wounded empire, no matter how large, was vulnerable to a small, ruthless, and determined force that knew exactly where to strike. Pizarro had 106 foot soldiers, 62 horsemen, 3 muskets, and 2 small cannons, against 80,000 Inca warriors. By any rational calculation, his expedition was doomed. He should have turned around and gone home. But Pizarro had one crucial advantage that no one, least of all the Inca, fully understood. He had information. He knew about the Civil War. He knew the empire was fractured, and he knew that the fastest way to paralyze the entire Inca system was to capture the Sapa Inca himself. Pizarro also had something else. The example of Hernán Cortés, who had conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico just a decade earlier, using almost the exact same playbook, capture the ruler. Exploit internal divisions, use indigenous allies who resent the dominant power. Pizarro wasn't inventing a strategy, he was copying one that had already proven devastatingly effective. The Inca had never heard of the Aztecs. They had no way of knowing that this same story had already played out on the other side of the continent. On November 15th, 1532, Pizarro's men entered the city of Cajamarca and found it nearly empty. Most of the inhabitants had withdrawn in advance. Atahualpa's enormous army was camped on the heights above the city. That night, Pizarro devised a plan of breathtaking audacity. He would invite the Sapa Inca into the city square for a meeting, and then he would spring an ambush. If you are drifting off now, that is perfectly fine. This story has waited 500 years. It can wait until morning. The next afternoon, November 16th, Atahualpa entered the square with about 6,000 attendants. They were unarmed, dressed in ceremonial garments. Many wore gold or silver discs on their heads. The Sapa Inca himself was carried on a litter lined with parrot feathers and covered in silver, borne by 80 courtiers of high rank in vivid blue robes. He intended to impress these strange visitors with a display of imperial splendor. He had no expectation of an ambush. The Spanish had hidden themselves in the buildings around the square. Infantry and horsemen crouched in alleyways. Cannons were concealed in a stone building at the center. The plaza was empty and silent. When Atahualpa noticed the absence, he called out, asking where the visitors were. A priest emerged, carrying a cross and a book. Through an interpreter, he demanded that Atahualpa accept Christianity and acknowledge the Spanish king as his ruler. Atahualpa, the most powerful ruler in the Americas, the descendant of the sun god, the man who had just won a devastating civil war, was being told to submit to a foreign king he'd never heard of, and a god he'd never worshipped. He was insulted and confused. He examined the book, which meant nothing to him since the Inca had no writing system, and threw it to the ground. Pizarro gave the signal. The cannons fired. The cavalry charged from the alleyways. Gunfire and the thunder of hooves filled the square. The Inca had never seen horses. They had never heard cannon fire. They had never encountered steel armor or gunpowder. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical violence. In the panic, the Inca trampled each other trying to escape. Thousands were killed, not a single Spaniard died, and Pizarro's men seized Atahualpa, dragging the Sapa Inca from his litter in the middle of the chaos. In less than 2 hours, 168 men had captured the living god of an empire of millions. The 80,000 soldiers camped outside the city could have overwhelmed the Spanish at any moment. But without the Sapa Inca to give the order, they were paralyzed. The entire command structure of the empire ran through one man, and that man was now a prisoner in a stone room in Cajamarca. It was as if someone had severed the nerve connecting a brain to its body. The body was still alive, still enormous, still powerful, but it couldn't move. And here is the thing that makes this catastrophe even more devastating. It wasn't just that Atahualpa was captured. It was that the Inca system was designed in a way that made his capture almost impossible to recover from. The Sapa Inca was the entire system. He was the divine authority that legitimized every administrator, every military commander, every provincial governor. Without him, no one knew who had the right to give orders. Atahualpa, held prisoner, tried to negotiate his freedom. He offered to fill a room measuring roughly 22 feet long by 17 feet wide with gold, and to fill 2 similar rooms with silver. The Spanish agreed. For months, gold and silver poured in from across the empire. Temples were stripped. Sacred objects were melted. The ransom was extraordinary, worth hundreds of millions in today's currency. While imprisoned, Atahualpa was treated with a strange mixture of respect and cruelty. The Spanish taught him chess, which he reportedly learned quickly. His wives were allowed to attend him. But all the while, the man who had commanded millions was a puppet used by Pizarro to keep the Inca armies docile. Atahualpa even ordered the execution of his brother Huascar from prison, fearing that Pizarro would ally with the legitimate claimant against him. Think about the scale of what was happening. The sacred treasures of an entire civilization, objects that had been crafted and venerated for generations, were being melted into bars so that a handful of foreign adventurers could divide the spoils. The gold was weighed, catalogued, and distributed among Pizarro's men. Each common soldier received roughly 45 pounds of gold and 90 pounds of silver. It was the largest ransom ever paid in human history, and it changed nothing. But Pizarro had no intention of releasing the Sapa Inca. Atahualpa alive was useful for keeping the Inca armies at bay. But Atahualpa alive was also dangerous. In July of 1533, the Spanish staged a mock trial, found him guilty of treason and heresy, and executed him. The living god of the Inca was strangled with a garrote in the public square of Cajamarca. The empire shattered, not all at once. The resistance would continue for decades. Manco Inca, another of Huayna Capac's sons, was initially installed as a puppet ruler by the Spanish. When he realized that the Spanish had no intention of sharing power, he led a revolt and laid siege to Cusco in 1536, with an army of tens of thousands. He came remarkably close to recapturing the capital, at one point setting the city ablaze. But the same factors that had doomed the Inca from the beginning continued to work against them. Subject peoples who had resented Inca rule, the Canari, the Chachapoya, the Huanca, sided with the Spanish against their former overlords. The Spanish had horses and steel and gunpowder, and the diseases kept killing. Wave after wave of epidemics. Smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, reduced the population from perhaps 9 million to barely 1 million within 50 years of contact. The Inca style of warfare also put them at a disadvantage. Their military traditions were highly ritualized. Battles followed established patterns. Tactics like deception, ambush, and changing strategy mid-battle were not part of their military culture, the Spanish. By contrast, had been fighting continuous wars across Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries. They were experts at improvisation, treachery, and exploiting any moment of weakness. The Inca warriors were brave and numerous, but they were fighting by rules their enemies didn't even know existed. Manco Inca eventually retreated to the remote mountain region of Vilcabamba, deep in the cloud forests east of Cusco. There he established the Neo-Inca state, a small but defiant kingdom that would hold out for another 36 years. His successors continued to resist from this remote stronghold, ruling over a shrinking territory, but keeping the idea of the Inca alive. The jungle that had marked the eastern frontier of the empire now became its last refuge. The Spanish, meanwhile, were reshaping the conquered territory into something entirely different. They founded new cities, including Lima on the coast, which would become the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. They imposed Christianity, dismantled Inca religious sites, and established the encomienda system, which effectively enslaved the indigenous population through forced labor. The meter system that the Inca had used for collective projects was repurposed by the Spanish to work the silver mines at Potosi, where conditions were so brutal that the mountain itself became known as the mountain that eats men. It wasn't until 1572, 40 years after Atahualpa's capture, that the Spanish finally conquered Vilcabamba and executed the last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru. The Spanish Viceroy Francisco de Toledo ordered the campaign to finally eliminate the Neo-Inca state, which had been a persistent thorn in colonial authority and a symbol of indigenous resistance. Spanish forces, accompanied by indigenous allies, fought through the dense cloud forests to reach the hidden capital. Tupac Amaru was captured and hauled to Cusco in chains. The Spanish gave him a summary trial and sentenced him to death. On the day of his execution, the main plaza of Cusco was packed with thousands of indigenous people. As the executioner prepared, the wailing of the crowd grew so loud that the Spanish authorities feared a riot. Tupac Amaru raised his hand to silence the crowd, and in that gesture, the last Inca exercised his authority one final time. Then the blade fell, and with Tupac Amaru's death, the last ember of the Inca state was extinguished. An empire that had taken less than a century to build had taken only 40 years to destroy. So what was the fatal mistake? That is the question that historians have debated for 5 centuries. And the answer depends on where you look. Some point to the centralized power structure. The Inca built everything around the Sapa Inca, which made the empire incredibly efficient but also incredibly fragile. Remove the emperor and the entire system froze. There was no plan B, no decentralized governance that could continue functioning without the head of state. Others point to the succession system. Without a clear rule of inheritance, every transition of power was a potential civil war. And when disease killed both the emperor and his heir simultaneously, the structural weakness was exposed at the worst possible moment. Others argue it was the speed of expansion itself. The Inca absorbed so many different peoples so quickly that they never had time to build deep loyalty. When the crisis came, conquered peoples saw an opportunity to settle old scores rather than rallying to defend the empire that had conquered them, and this is something that often gets overlooked. In the story, the Spanish didn't conquer the Inca alone. They had thousands of indigenous allies who joined them specifically because they wanted the Inca gone. The Canary, still bearing scars from Atahualpa's massacres, fought alongside Pizarro with fierce determination. The Huanca people of the Central Highlands provided logistical support that kept the Spanish fed and supplied. The Chachapoya warriors joined the campaign against their old enemies with relish. Without these indigenous allies, the Spanish could not have survived, let alone conquered. In a bitter irony, many of these allied peoples would later find that Spanish rule was far worse than anything the Inca had imposed. The encomienda system, the forced labor in the mines, the systematic destruction of indigenous culture, these were catastrophes that the Inca overlords had never inflicted. The peoples who helped destroy the Inca Empire had unwittingly helped forge their own chains. And then there is the factor that no political decision could have prevented disease. The smallpox epidemic that swept through the Americas after European contact was a biological catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. It killed the emperor. It killed his heir. It devastated the working population. It disrupted the communication network, and it arrived years before any Spanish soldier appeared on the scene. But here is the thing that makes the Inca story so different from a simple tale of conquest. The Spanish didn't really conquer the Inca through military superiority. They conquered the Inca because the empire was already in free fall when they arrived. The disease had killed the leadership. The civil war had fractured the military. The subject peoples were ready to rebel. Pizarro and his 168 men walked into a catastrophe that was already unfolding and gave it the final push. If Huayna Capac and his heir hadn't died of smallpox, if the civil war hadn't happened, if the empire had been unified and at full strength when Pizarro arrived, 168 men with 3 muskets and 2 small cannons would not have conquered an empire of millions. They would have been a footnote, a curiosity that the Sapa Inca dealt with and moved on from. Consider what Atahualpa had at his disposal before the Spanish arrived. An army of 250,000 men, a road network that could move troops across 2,000 kilometers in under a week. Storehouses full of provisions, a chain of fortresses guarding every mountain pass. The Inca military had just won a brutal civil war precisely because it was so effective. If that machinery had been turned against 168 exhausted foreigners on an unfamiliar mountain road, the outcome would not have been close. And here is what makes this even more poignant. The Inca had actually encountered the Spanish before Cajamarca. Atahualpa's scouts had been tracking Pizarro's expedition for weeks. They knew how many men he had. They knew about the horses and the strange weapons. Atahualpa believed, with considerable reason, that 168 men posed no real threat to an army that had just defeated 60,000. He agreed to meet Pizarro not because he was naive, but because he was confident. The trap at Cajamarca worked, not because Atahualpa was foolish, but because the Spanish were doing something so unprecedented that no amount of intelligence could have prepared him for it. The fatal mistake, if you can call it that, was a combination of things that no one could have anticipated. A disease from another continent. A succession crisis triggered by that disease. A civil war that exhausted both sides, and a small group of opportunistic invaders who understood, with ruthless clarity, that the fastest way to destroy an empire built around one man was to seize that one man. The Inca roads still exist. You can walk them today, 500 years after the conquest. The stones that Inca engineers placed by hand are still holding firm against earthquakes, rain, and the slow erosion of time. The terraces they carved into mountainsides still grow crops. The walls they built without mortar still stand. And the descendants of the Inca are still here. More than 8 million people still speak Quechua, the language of the empire. The traditions, the music, the textiles, the agricultural knowledge. They survived the conquest. They survived the colonial period. They survive today, woven into the fabric of Andean life as deeply as the stones of Machu Picchu are set into its mountain. In 1780, almost 250 years after the conquest, a descendant of the last Inca ruler led the largest indigenous uprising in South American history. José Gabriel Condorcanqui took the name Tupac Amaru II and raised an army of tens of thousands against Spanish colonial rule. The rebellion was eventually crushed, and Tupac Amaru was executed in Cusco's main plaza, the same plaza where the last Inca ruler had been killed 2 centuries before. But the uprising proved that the memory of the Inca had never died. It was still there, burning beneath the surface. Even today, Inti Raymi, the festival of the Sunday, is celebrated in Cusco every June. Thousands gather to watch ceremonies that echo those performed by the Inca 500 years ago. The language endures, the farming techniques endure, the cultural identity endures. The empire fell, but the civilization refused to disappear entirely. If you've been following along tonight, thank you. And if you drifted off somewhere between the Quipu and the siege of Cusco, that is perfectly fine. That is what this is for. The Inca built something remarkable. They took the most difficult landscape on Earth and turned it into a functioning civilization. They did it without writing, without wheels, without iron. They did it with human ingenuity, collective labor, and an understanding of their environment that modern engineers still study and admire. And when it fell not because it was poorly, but because the world sensed something it had never been built to withstand. That is not a story about weakness. That is a story about the limits of even the greatest human achievements when faced with forces no one could have predicted. The Inca didn't fail. They were overwhelmed by a convergence of catastrophes that would have broken any civilization on Earth. And yet the roads remain. The terraces remain. The language remains. The people remain 5 centuries after the fall. The children of the Inca are still here, still speaking the language of the empire, still farming the terraces their ancestors carved from stone. That might be the most remarkable thing of all. Not how the empire fell, but how much of it refused to disappear. Subscribe and stick around. There are always more mysteries waiting. Good night. Good night.